They called it a temporary solution. Some officers were convinced this vehicle would quickly disappear and be forgotten. Instead, it survived for decades, while many more ambitious projects vanished into history. Why did Sweden keep a machine that critics considered outdated from the very beginning? What secret allowed it to outlive vehicles that looked far more powerful on paper? And were military experts completely wrong about the Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43? Today, we'll uncover the surprising story behind one of the most underrated armored vehicles in Swedish military history. If you're interested in tanks, secret military projects, and forgotten war machines, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are many more fascinating stories ahead. Enjoy the video, and let's continue. The late 1930s became a time of anxiety and uncertainty for Europe. The old order was rapidly collapsing, and news from neighboring countries increasingly forced the military to revise their plans. States were building up their armies, modernizing weapons, and preparing for potential conflicts, the scale of which no one could yet imagine. Against this backdrop, Sweden continued to adhere to its policy of neutrality, but even the most staunch supporters of diplomacy understood that declarations of peaceful intent alone might not be enough. The Swedish command closely watched how the nature of modern warfare was changing. Tank units attracted particularly close attention. Machines were becoming faster, better protected, and much more dangerous than just a few years before. If earlier armored vehicles were perceived as an important but far from decisive tool on the battlefield, the situation was now changing right before their eyes. Military experts concluded that future conflicts would be accompanied by the mass use of tanks, meaning the army would need a reliable means to combat them. The problem was that existing anti-tank guns no longer seemed like a universal solution. Their crews were vulnerable, and relocating to new positions often took too much time. In a fast-moving battle, this turned into a serious problem. While the gun was being prepared for firing, the situation could change several times. The question arose more and more often: what to do if the enemy broke through exactly where the anti-tank defense proved insufficient or lack mobility? In Sweden, they understood that copying other people's solutions without regard for their own capabilities would not work. The country had a developed industry, but its resources were limited compared to Europe's major military powers. Therefore, engineers and the military had to find their own way. They needed a machine capable of quickly occupying a favorable position, delivering a powerful strike, and just as quickly changing location without becoming an easy target for retaliatory fire. In parallel, lively discussions about the future of the armored forces were taking place in the army. Some officers believed it was necessary to focus on the development of tanks. Others insisted on creating specialized vehicles to fight armored vehicles. Each new report, each military exercise, and each foreign publication only heightened the feeling that time for reflection was running out. The experience of other European armies made an especially deep impression on Swedish specialists. It was obvious that armored vehicles were becoming one of the main tools of modern warfare. Tank formations could quickly cover long distances, bypass fortified areas, and create serious problems for the defending side. For a country striving to protect its own territory, such a prospect looked extremely alarming. Gradually, the idea of a new combat vehicle began to form in military circles. It was supposed to combine the mobility of armored vehicles and the firepower of an anti-tank gun. This approach made it possible to significantly increase the efficiency of fighting armored targets and simultaneously reduce reaction time to a sudden threat. On paper, the concept looked promising, but many difficult decisions lay ahead for the designers. It was during this period that the idea of the vehicle that would later receive the designation Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43 was born. At that time, no one could yet know what place it would occupy in the history of Swedish armoured vehicles. But already at the moment the project appeared, one thing was clear. The army expected to receive not just another combat vehicle, but a means capable of responding to the new challenges of a rapidly changing world. And the deeper the engineers dove into the work on the future self-propelled gun, the clearer the understanding became that the old methods of fighting tanks no longer met the requirements of the time. The more carefully the Swedish military studied the development of armoured vehicles abroad, the more obvious the unpleasant reality became. Anti-tank guns, which until recently were considered a reliable means of defence, were gradually beginning to yield to the demands of the new era. In exercises, situations were increasingly modelled where crews simply did not have time to react to the rapid advance of armoured units. Even well-prepared positions could turn out to be useless if the enemy changed the direction of the strike or used speed to bypass the defence. The main problem lay in the very nature of towed artillery. Transport was required to move the gun. Preparing a new position took time, and any delay could cost dearly on the battlefield. While the crew was deploying the gun and preparing to fire, the tanks could already be at a dangerous distance. In theory, everything looked simple enough, but real conditions forced a revision of many established ideas. Additional difficulties were created by the constantly growing protection level of armoured vehicles. Designers around the world were actively strengthening the armour of machines, increasing engine power and improving armament. What until recently was considered a serious obstacle for a tank was gradually turning into just another element of the combat situation. The military needed a means that could not only defeat modern machines, but also accompany its own units in a fast-changing battle. The Swedish army faced a difficult choice. They could continue to improve existing guns, trying to squeeze the maximum out of already known solutions. However, more and more specialists came to the conclusion that the problem was much deeper. What was needed was not just a new gun, but a fundamentally different approach to fighting armoured vehicles. At this point, self-propelled mounts began to attract more and more attention. The idea looked very logical. If a powerful anti-tank gun was placed on an armoured chassis, the vehicle could move independently, quickly change positions, and react to threats much more effectively. This concept allowed combining the firepower of artillery and the mobility of armoured vehicles into a single combat complex. However, the path from an idea to a real machine always turns out to be much more complicated than it seems at first glance. When the discussions moved into a practical plane, engineers faced a number of limitations. It was necessary to consider industrial capabilities, the availability of suitable components, production timelines, and financial costs. Sweden could not afford endless experiments. The future machine had to be effective enough, but at the same time remain a realistic project for mass production. That was when work began on a new self-propelled mount that was supposed to solve several problems at once. The military wanted a machine capable of confidently fighting enemy armoured vehicles, quickly taking up advantageous positions and maintaining an acceptable level of protection for the crew. At the same time, the project could not be turned into an overly complex or expensive development. The designers decided to use existing experience and rely as much as possible on existing solutions. This approach made it possible to speed up the process of creating the machine and reduce production risks. Instead of starting everything from scratch, the engineers focused on adapting proven elements for the new task. Gradually, the first outlines of the future combat vehicle began to appear on the drafting boards. With each new design decision, it acquired more of its own character. The designers faced a difficult task to find a balance between firepower, mobility, and protection. Any improvement of one parameter inevitably affected the others, forcing them to look for compromises in literally every detail. Nevertheless, the work moved forward. Despite all the difficulties, Swedish engineers were confident that they were creating a machine capable of significantly strengthening the capabilities of the army. But very soon, it would turn out that for the appearance of the Pansarvärnskanonvagn /43, a series of compromises would have to be made, without which this project could never have gone beyond design offices. The further the development of the new self-propelled mount progressed, the more often engineers had to face harsh reality. On drawings, one could create almost any machine, but turning it into a production model was much more difficult. Every decision required a choice between what was desired and what was possible. That is why the history of the Pansarvärnskanonvagn /43 largely became a history of compromises, without which the project simply would not have come into existence. One of the first tasks was to define the base platform. Creating a completely new chassis would have required a huge expenditure of time and resources, which simply did not exist in the tense international situation. Therefore, it was decided to use existing developments of Swedish armored vehicles. This approach made it possible to speed up development, but at the same time imposed certain limitations on the future design. The designers understood that increasing the armor would inevitably lead to an increase in mass. A heavier vehicle would require a more powerful engine, which would again affect the mass and cost. This vicious circle was well known to engineers in all countries. As a result, they had to look for a reasonable balance. The protection had to allow the crew to operate confidently on the battlefield, but nobody intended to turn the machine into a heavy and slow armored object. The question of layout turned out to be no less complicated. To accommodate a powerful gun and ensure the work of the crew, enough internal space was required. However, increasing the size of the machine automatically made it a more visible target. Therefore, engineers tried to maintain the most compact silhouette possible while providing acceptable conditions for the crew. Each new stage of design was accompanied by calculations, discussions, and adjustments. Some ideas looked promising but turned out to be too expensive. Others provided good performance but complicated production. As a result, the future self-propelled gun gradually acquired the appearance that would later become well known to the Swedish military. But all compromises lost their meaning if the machine could not effectively perform its main task. Therefore, special attention was paid to the armament. It was this that was to become the main argument of the new combat vehicle on the battlefield. At the center of the project was a powerful gun designed to fight armored vehicles. The military understood perfectly well that speed and armor are important only up to a certain point. The real value of a self-propelled gun comes from its ability to hit dangerous targets at significant distances. That is why armament was viewed as a key element of the entire design. For its time, the installed gun looked like a very serious weapon. It allowed fighting most of the tanks that could potentially become opponents of Sweden. The high initial velocity of the projectile ensured good accuracy, and the penetration characteristics commanded respect even by the standards of military specialists of that period. The possibility of opening fire from pre-prepared positions was considered an especially important advantage. The self-propelled gun could use the features of the terrain, hide its hull behind natural covers, and display only the minimum necessary part of the machine to the enemy. This approach significantly increased its combat capabilities and made it possible to use the power of the gun as effectively as possible. Military exercises gradually confirmed the correctness of the chosen concept. The crews noted that the combination of mobility and serious armament gives new tactical possibilities. Where conventional artillery required time to deploy, the self-propelled gun could act much faster. This was especially valued in conditions of a rapidly changing situation. However, no technology is perfect. The more actively the tests were conducted, the more nuances began to manifest. Some of them turned out to be quite expected. Others came as an unpleasant surprise, even for the developers. The first tests confirmed that the machine indeed possessed serious potential. It moved confidently over various types of terrain, demonstrated good firepower indicators, and met many army requirements. But at the same time, the testers began to record a number of features that could not be ignored. One of the main topics of discussion was crew protection. Despite the presence of armor, the design of the self-propelled gun did not provide the level of safety that the military wanted to see. Some decisions that kept the mass within reasonable limits inevitably affected the degree of protection of the machine. Special attention was paid to internal ergonomics. The limited dimensions of the hull forced the crew to work in quite cramped conditions. During short tests, this did not look like a serious problem, but long-term operation showed that the comfort of the crew directly affects the efficiency of performing tasks. Questions also arose regarding individual elements of the structure. Some components required refinement, others needed strengthening. Such comments were quite normal for any new technology, but they showed that the path from a promising project to a fully developed combat vehicle was still far from complete. At the same time, the overall assessment remained positive. The military saw before them not an experimental sample for the sake of an experiment, but a very real tool for strengthening the country's anti-tank defense. Yes, the machine had flaws. Yes, some decisions caused debate, but its strengths were too obvious to abandon the project. As a result, more and more signs indicated that the Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43 would soon move from the category of a promising development into the category of a full-fledged combat vehicle. And it was then that a completely new stage would begin for it: service in the army, where any design passes the most important test of time. After the completion of the main tests, the moment came for which the entire machine was created. The Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43 began to enter service with the Swedish army. For the designers, this was confirmation that their work had received recognition, and for the military, an opportunity to test the new technology in real service conditions, albeit without participation in major combat conflicts. The self-propelled gun took its place in the country's anti-tank defense system. It was viewed as a mobile reserve capable of quickly reinforcing the most vulnerable sectors of defense. In the conditions of the Swedish landscape, such a concept looked very reasonable. Forests, hills, lakes, and numerous natural covers created favorable conditions for ambush actions, and a compact self-propelled unit fit well into such tactics. During exercises, crews practiced rapid deployment to firing positions, striking a conventional enemy, and immediate change of location. It was in such scenarios that the strengths of the machine were most clearly manifested.
It could appear where it was not expected, open fire, and disappear before the enemy could organize retaliatory actions. However, the military's attitude toward the machine could not be called exclusively enthusiastic. Some officers highly rated its capabilities and considered it an important element of defense. Others pointed out the limitations of the design and noted that the development of armored vehicles was happening so fast that any technology risked becoming obsolete before it fully revealed its potential. Nevertheless, the self-propelled gun continued its service. With each year, its crews accumulated operational experience, and the command received more and more information about the strengths and weaknesses of the machine. It was this practical experience that would soon cause a whole series of modernizations. By the beginning of the post-war period, the world of armored vehicles was changing rapidly. Tanks were getting more powerful engines, new weapon systems, and increased protection. What, until recently, was considered a serious threat to any armored vehicle was gradually ceasing to look so convincing. The Swedish military understood perfectly well that without updates, even successful technology would quickly lose relevance. Therefore, the Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43 began to be gradually improved. One of the most noticeable directions of modernization was the strengthening of armament. The army sought to maintain the vehicle's ability to fight modern targets, so the issue of increasing firepower turned out to be one of the priorities. Changes also affected other elements of the structure. Some components were redesigned to increase reliability, and individual technical solutions were adapted to new operational requirements. The designers tried to extend the service life of the machine as much as possible, using all the accumulated experience of previous years. It is especially telling that modernizations were carried out not for the sake of formality. Each update reflected real changes in military doctrine and the assessment of potential threats. The army was not going to keep the self-propelled gun in service solely out of habit. If the machine continued to serve, it meant it still remained useful. As a result, the Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43 was able to survive several stages of armored vehicle development and maintain its value much longer than many expected at the time of its appearance. But to truly understand its place in history, it is necessary to look at it in an international context. When specialists compare the Swedish self-propelled gun with foreign counterparts, it becomes obvious that it occupied a rather unusual position. Many countries during World War II and immediately after actively created their own anti-tank vehicles. However, the approaches to solving the same problem differed markedly. German designers often bet on the most powerful armament possible, sometimes sacrificing ease of operation. Soviet developers sought to provide a combination of efficiency and mass production. American engineers paid great attention to mobility and versatility of use. Against this background, the Swedish school of design went its own way. The Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43 was created primarily to protect the territory of Sweden. It was not planned to be used in large-scale offensive operations thousands of kilometers away from home bases. Therefore, many decisions were made based on the specifics of national defense. This made it possible to achieve a good fit with the tasks set, but at the same time made the machine less versatile compared to some foreign models. In terms of firepower,
the self-propelled gun looked quite decent for its period. It could effectively perform its main function and represented a serious threat to the armored vehicles of its time.
At the same time, its protection and overall concept were already beginning to reflect the philosophy of a transition period, when armies were still looking for the optimal appearance of future anti-tank vehicles. It is also interesting that many foreign counterparts disappeared from the scene quite quickly. Some projects turned out to be too complex, others too expensive, and third options simply did not live up to the military's expectations. The Swedish machine did not claim the status of a revolutionary breakthrough, but instead demonstrated that quality which often turns out to be much more important than loud characteristics: practicality. It was thanks to this practicality that the Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43 was able to take a special place in the history of Swedish armoured vehicles. But the most surprising thing was that its service continued much longer than even the most optimistic supporters of the project could have assumed at the moment of its appearance. When the Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43 project was just being born, few could have suggested how long the service of this machine would turn out to be. Military equipment usually lives by rather harsh laws. A new generation of weapons appears, the requirements of the army change, and yesterday's promising developments gradually give way to more modern models. However, in the case of the Swedish self-propelled gun, history went according to a somewhat different scenario. The reason lay not in some revolutionary technology or unique technical solution. The secret of its longevity turned out to be much more prosaic. The machine performed well exactly those tasks for which it was created. It was understandable in operation, relatively reliable, and effective enough for the conditions in which it was planned to be used. The Swedish army traditionally paid great attention to the rational use of technology. If a combat vehicle continued to meet requirements and could bring real benefit, they were in no hurry to retire it just for the sake of the appearance of a newer model. That is why the Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43 remained in service significantly longer than many of its contemporaries. Over the years of service, the self-propelled gun survived several generations of armoured vehicles. While new tanks appeared in other countries, fire control systems were improved and ideas about future warfare changed, the Swedish machine continued to perform its duties. Of course, its capabilities no longer looked as impressive as at the moment of appearance, but it still remained a useful element of defense. It is especially telling that many young officers first became acquainted with this technology already as a veteran of the service. For older generations of the military, it was a promising novelty, and for new crews, a long familiar part of the armed forces. Such longevity always says that the project turned out to be more successful than it might seem with a superficial study of the characteristics. But even more important was something else. Over the years of operation, the machine turned into a kind of school for Swedish engineers. Every identified flaw, every successful solution, and every experience of modernization became a valuable source of knowledge for future developments. In the history of military equipment, far from every project becomes a direct ancestor of new generations of machines. However, the Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43 had a noticeable impact on the development of the Swedish engineering school. Work on it allowed accumulating experience that later came in handy when creating more modern models of armoured vehicles. Engineers received the opportunity to study the real features of self-propelled mount operation, understand the requirements of crews, and evaluate the effectiveness of various technical solutions in the long term.
Theoretical calculations are important, but nothing replaces years of practical use of technology in the troops. Of particular value were the conclusions related to the layout of the machine, the organization of the crew's working space, and the combination of mobility with firepower. Many questions that first seriously manifested themselves precisely on the Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43 were later taken into account already at new stages of development of Swedish armoured vehicles. In addition, the project clearly showed the advantages of a pragmatic approach to the development of armaments. Swedish engineers did not strive at all costs to create sensational machines capable of surprising the world with unusual solutions. It was much more important to get technology that could really serve the army for many years and perform the tasks set. To a certain extent, it was this approach that would later become one of the characteristic features of the Swedish School of Military Engineering. Many well-known models of armoured vehicles that appeared in subsequent decades would be created taking into account the experience accumulated back in the days of the Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43. And yet, the most interesting part begins when historians try to evaluate this machine decades after the completion of its service. Here, opinions begin to differ markedly. Some researchers call the Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43 a typical product of its time. In their opinion, the self-propelled gun was only a transitional stage in the development of armoured vehicles, which fulfilled its task and gave way to more advanced machines. There is a certain logic in this view. By modern standards, its characteristics have long looked modest, and many technical solutions seem outdated. Other historians hold a completely different point of view. They believe that the significance of the project is much greater than it might seem at first glance. After all, this machine appeared exactly when Sweden was looking for its own path of development of armoured vehicles and trying to adapt to a rapidly changing world. In such conditions, the creation of an effective self-propelled unit became an important achievement for the national industry. Especially often, specialists draw attention to the amazing combination of simplicity and efficiency. The Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43 did not try to become the most powerful or most technologically advanced machine of its time. Instead, it offered a reasonable balance of characteristics and demonstrated a high level of practicality. Perhaps that is why interest in it remains even today. Against the background of numerous loud projects that promised to change history but quickly disappeared from the troops, the Swedish self-propelled gun looks like an example of a completely different approach. It did not strike the imagination with fantastic characteristics, but it honestly performed its work for many years. This is probably where the main paradox of the Pansarvärnskanonvagn M/43 lies. A machine that is rarely called legendary managed to survive many more ambitious projects. A self-propelled gun, created as an answer to the alarming challenges of its era, became an important part of the history of Swedish armoured vehicles, and proved that loud statements do not always determine the real value of a combat machine. Decades after its appearance, it remains an interesting example of how competent engineering solutions, practicality, and sober calculation sometimes turn out to be much more important than the desire to set another record.